Welcome all to this seminar of the Center for International Environmental Studies at the Graduate Institute. My name is Anne Saab. I am an assistant professor in the International Law Department at the Institute, and I am associated with the Center for International Environmental Studies. And I'm very, very pleased to see so many of you here in this virtual seminar. And thank you so much, as always, to Andina for organizing this equally well in this virtual sphere, as you always do when we get to see each other and organize these events in person. So I'm going to introduce our speaker for today and then just briefly go over the structure of today's seminar so that you all know how this is going to go. So our speaker for today, I'm very, very happy to introduce Rosaline Rimans. She's a senior scientist with the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. And Rosaline, please do feel free to add things in introducing yourself as well. The topic of her presentation today is biodiversity in our food systems, which I have no doubt is a topic that is relevant and important more than ever. The way that we're going to organize the session is that Rosaline will speak for about 30 minutes, and she'll use slides, so you should be able to see those on your screen. We will have time at the end, about 20 minutes, hopefully, for a question and answer. We are quite a small group in this event, so if you do have any questions during the presentation, you can feel free to ask them. So all you need to do is turn on your microphone, and ask your question. You can also type in the question in the chat box if that's easier for you, and then we'll give you the time to ask your question. We are going to have a Q&A at the end as well, and what I'll try to do is to collect 2 or 3 questions and then give Rosaline the chance to respond to those. An important thing that I should mention is that this event is recorded. So when you ask your question, you'll be recorded as well. So just so that everybody knows that and that you're okay with that. The recording of the seminar is going to be available on the SAIS website in about a week's time. And I will give a few final practical information at the end of the session. Just one small thing, it is a small group, but it would be very useful if everybody can turn off your microphones when you're not speaking. So unless you're speaking, please turn off your microphone so that we have as little as possible background noise. So without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Rosaline, and we look forward to hearing.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the introduction, and very nice to meet you all virtually. As this is indeed set up as a small group, I really ask, don't hesitate to interrupt me as we go through. The idea is to make this interactive as well. So we will dive into the biodiversity in our food systems today. And the first question that I have to you as an audience, and it's really interesting to see kind of a diverse set of participants that have signed up to this. So the first question I have is, what do you actually think of first? What comes first to your mind when you hear nowadays biodiversity in our food systems? And just speak up or put in the chat. Just take 10 seconds. Anybody wants to speak up? I don't see the chat actually as a presenter. I see plant genes, agriculture, agroforestry, great, agroecology. Okay, a lot of different things come up all around agriculture, agroecology. I was actually wondering if anyone would mention also COVID-19 or Corona. There is meat production coming up, as there are also a bunch of articles in the popular press as well as in the scientific press now coming about out about the root causes of the virus and some more of the long-term potential solutions around this. And they all also link to biodiversity in our food systems. Now, we will come later to that. Just that often, indeed, when we ask the question, people think very, very much first about the biodiversity of our crops, livestock, and fish. But it's also broader than that. And this is, of course, a critical part of it. But it's also the biodiversity in our food genetic resource systems management. How do we conserve, how do we manage this diversity in different ways looking at the future? This is, for example, the seed vault in Norway, where it's a global collection of the genetic resources of food and agriculture and useful plants and genetics, also in seed banks, as well as the crop wild relatives in the wild and management of the wild relatives of the crops in the wild. It's the biodiversity in our agricultural landscapes, not just the crops and the livestock that are in those landscapes, but also the diversity in our soils, the soil biodiversity, the diversity in the associated landscapes or pieces of land within agricultural landscapes. And it's also the wild biodiversity connected to our food system in non-managed land. And here you can think about it in two parts. On one part, it's some of the wild biodiversity that is collected and used as food by different groups of populations. And on the other hand, the diversity and the wild biodiversity non-management land, how this interacts with the agricultural land, how it's threatened by it, how it contributes in an indirect way to agriculture. And then the biodiversity in our food markets. When you go shopping, what type of diversity do you see there in terms of biological species, not in terms of product, but in terms of biological species and varieties that are in these markets? And then when we come to more the end of the value chain, it's of course also the biodiversity in our diets around the globe. So when we talk about biodiversity in our food systems, we don't talk only about the agriculture piece. We actually talk about also the connection of biodiversity in our food system between these different pieces, from the inputs, the genetic resources, the landscapes, up to what happens during the supply chain also to it, and up to the consumer and ourselves. So, and all of these are connected with each other. And now you hear also more and more talk about the One Health in the One Health approach in the situation where we are globally facing now with the COVID crisis. That when we think about our human health, that it's connected with the health of our environment, and that if we manage it more as a whole health and look at the different parts and how they interact, we can see where some of the potential trade-offs and synergies are. So with this first introduction, I want to trigger a bit your thinking to think about biodiversity in our food systems, not just as the agriculture piece, but as the agriculture piece connected with these other pieces. And you can think about this across different scales and how these different scales also interact with each other. And that's on the right side. Now, with this kind of broader concept of biodiversity in our food systems, why do you think biodiversity in our food systems is actually important? I mean, why do we really care about it? Is it just, why do we really care about it? Why is it important? And I'll ask again to just speak up or to put something in the chat, from what perspective you are coming from. Ecological balance, to increase system resilience, health, cultural values, Wait, CO2 sink. Okay, super. You see already that there is indeed a diversity of things that is coming out of why biodiversity is important in our food systems. Health was mentioned, so if we start now the other way around, in the previous, or like what is biodiversity, we started more from the production side. Now let's start from the consumption side. Like biodiversity is important in terms of our diets. And here you see kind of a simple depiction of how different nutrients are met based on what is in the diet. And if you start adding different things to your diet, you meet different nutritional needs that we have as human beings. So one thing is diversity in our diet is important to meet our nutritional requirements. And as a human being, we need a large diversity of essential nutrients, and they also interact with each other. So we need a total of 51 essential nutrients, and different crops have different nutritional profiles and are very complementary to each other in their nutritional profile. And this is kind of such a fascinating interactions that we as humans have had over time with the nature around us and how we manage these in order to manage a diversity of crops to satisfy our diversity of human needs as for a healthy diet. And we see often that low dietary diversity is a critical issue in large parts of the development world, as well as in the more high-rich countries as well, that adds to a high rate of malnutrition. Is it undernutrition or is it malnutrition in terms of enough calories but not enough micronutrients? And that diversity can help be part of the solution to better meet or nutritional diversity for a healthy diet, rather than a diet that just provides calories to fill your stomach. And this we see across different settings. I mean, it's very well established in the nutritional world that diversity is such important to meet your nutrient adequacy. It's not only the food group. So in nutrition, we think about food groups like cereals, legumes, meat, but it's also the diversity within each of those food groups that contributes further to adequate nutrition. Like the diversity of cereals offers you even a diversity rather than just one type of cereal or one variety of cereals. And also even within a species, you have a large diversity of varieties that have different nutritional profiles. So when we think about biodiversity and diets, it's not only type of the food groups, it's also at the species level and at the variety level, where there is a lot of potential and a lot of opportunity to improve our diets. Then on the production side, as several of you mentioned, there is a critical importance of biodiversity in our production systems for ecological balance and for providing different ecosystem services. If we look at kind of more, and this is a very simplified illustration of this, if we look at kind of a monoculture cropland, it's mainly managed to provide cropped foods. While if we look at the more integrated mixed systems, you have different ecosystem services that landscape then provides, and that makes it a more functional, more balanced ecosystem. This in terms of soil quality, greenhouse gas mitigations, and in terms of soil capturing, which was mentioned also in terms of pest regulation. So it's again that idea of multifunctionality that is so important for the balance of our ecosystems. And this, of course, it's not just throwing 5 different species together in any context and it's solved. No, it's kind of a really interesting puzzle of which species work well together in which context. So it's a knowledge intensive way practice to manage, but there's so much knowledge around that built over time through our interaction between humans and nature over time, as well as the science that studies ecology and agriculture together. For example, this milpa system in Mexico is an example where you have maize together with pumpkin, together with beans, and together with chili peppers. Does any one of you know the system and maybe know why kind of these different plants are being produced together? No? Okay, so I can share you something new. So here, the beauty of it is that the beans, they can fix nitrogen out of the air and give this also to the other plants. And maize is a plant that is particularly high demanding for nitrogen. Then at the same time, the maize, they provide a bit of protection from the sun for the other plants, and as well as a climbing structure where the beans can climb on, so they can better grow. Then the pumpkin is kind of a cover crop and helps with the water retention of the system and really benefits from the shade from the maize. Then the chilies, they actually are they are a natural pest, like a natural type of protection against birds and against pests, because they have certain chemicals that holds away that birds cannot eat, and that also the pests are staying away from, and that are also used in some of the medicines. So in an ecological sense, they really are very complementary to each other. While if you look at the diet perspective, they also really complement each other. The beans are offering proteins and a lot of minerals and fibers. The maize provides a lot of calories. The pumpkin provides a lot of vitamin A, and then the chilies provide taste in addition. So this is just as one example of how these different species are really complementary to each other and fit particularly well in these subtropical regions. So this multifunctionality comes back again, and the science around that has really been building over time, and has really been, the evidence around that has really become stronger over time. Well, originally it were many kind of different cultures that were managing it, but combining this together with the advances in science has really put this more upfront. And then, so we continue about why biodiversity is important in our food system. Of course, the other piece is agriculture and biodiversity habitat management. Agriculture is one of the major drivers of land use change and of biodiversity loss, but at the same time, it needs to be therefore also part of the solution. And here you see kind of changes in land use and changes this is land use by agriculture, and this is changes in land use. And here it's really important also, again, like this discussion that is going around now about the potential root causes of the coronavirus, and that we might face more pandemics like that, as we are really disrupting the balance in these ecosystems and disrupting a lot of the habitat for the biodiversity. And how can we manage agriculture and the biodiversity relationship with agriculture better in order to better prevent and manage such risks, and not disrupt that balance so much that some of you also talked about in the chat. And some of you talked about also mentioned resilience, building resilience. And this indeed is also a critical point where how can we manage the biodiversity in our food systems to build more resilience, but to balance this also with a certain level of efficiency in order to move forward and to not be stagnant. So where do we find that window of vitality that provides opportunity to advance and move ahead while not kind of moving towards collapse? And here, just an example, kind of a real example related to that. And yeah, then I already said the answer a bit. What do potatoes, banana, and cacao have in common related to biodiversity and resilience in our food system? I don't know if maybe some of you are working around that, or probably you all eat them from time to time. Any guesses on that? No. So it's all of these three crops actually, they were hit by a major disease, and their production and their whole value chain was actually critically disrupted. And this would largely be explained also that they were dependent on only one variety or one major variety of potato, banana, and cacao in these production system. And when a disease hit, a plant disease hit, the whole kind of production as well as the related value chains and livelihoods depending on that got a bit hit and a big shock. So this is if we have more diversity, we build more resilience in our systems to prevent, to be more resilient for such type of shocks. And this is an example in the food system, but if we think, I mean, a very specific example for these crops, but if we think about it at a bigger level, we face so many multiple risks at such a big scale. And this was published in the beginning of this year, and I think then even food crisis, like all the societal crises, were a bit, I think, underestimated also in terms of infectious diseases, etc. But this also to mention that we face so many risks, and we can plan to prepare better and anticipate better for a couple of specific risks, but we also need to prepare for risks that we might not know, that we might not anticipate yet, like this corona crisis. We didn't really anticipate that as a human society at a sufficient scale. We know that we are facing a huge climate crisis. How do we prepare ourselves better to anticipate, for on one hand, these big risks that we are mapping out better, combined to a certain risks that we completely don't know yet. And this is where a colleague of mine, Walter Baskin, who is a climate scientist, he always says we need a kind of a paradigm shift. And instead of thinking about and building a boat like the Ark from Noah, where we can all get on and kind of prepare for one specific doom scenario, because there will be a storm hit, we need to build a boat to leave off. We need kind of a paradigm shift and building resilience more across our system to anticipate multiple risks, also the risks that we don't know yet. And this is the ginkgo biloba tree, and this is one of the first new lives that sprouted out again after the Hiroshima atomic bomb fell there. All life was destroyed. Nobody, I mean, had as expected there such a shock. And the ginkgo biloba tree was one of the first that started to live again in that area afterwards. And it's an interesting kind of metaphor, because the ginkgo biloba tree is this kind of very old fossil tree that it's not very productive you don't see many of those trees, and they take a long time to grow, but they have a large genetic diversity within their genome. And so it's just as a metaphor to think that we need to build in more diversity in our systems to be able to bounce back and have more resilience for all types of shocks, also the shocks that we don't prepare for, compared to building just a boat to prepare for one specific shock. And again, this comes then to this multifunctionality of biodiversity in our food systems. Biodiversity, it's important from the consumption up to our stocks and kind of to the conservation and of biodiversity and our genetic resources. And it's this multifunctionality that allows biodiversity to be a potential lever of systems change versus just be a solution for one specific challenge or the other. And yeah, just to restate it again, that it's not just important at the local scale. All biodiversity in our food systems is so much connected with each other. And it's important to look at it at different scales and recognize how these different scales are connected. So the biodiversity in the food systems in Kenya also matters to us here. Now, how is biodiversity in our food systems changing, actually? And here, like many of the biodiversity stories, it's not such a happy story. We are seeing increasing homogeneity in our food systems. This is kind of like how this is our national food supplies, and you see that they are over time, they're getting closer and closer to each other. Because they're more and more becoming more and more similar. If you now go to a workshop in Rwanda, you will often get the same types of fruits during the break than when you go to a workshop here. And that's not particularly a bad thing, but we are losing diversity in our food systems also overall. And this is because the global food supply systems relies increasingly on a few crops and animal species. We have such a large diversity of plant species out there, and a large diversity of plant species that have been used or are used at a small scale for food, but only 3 species actually provide more than 50% of our calories, and 12 crops together with 5 animal species provide 75% of our food today. So we have been building a system that relies really heavily on just a few crops and just a few animal species, which also reduces the opportunity to make these smart nature-based systems where you have a lot of complementary in those. And this, of course, it's in line with, and it's part of this bigger picture of overall biodiversity loss, where a big message is that we are just not living in harmony with nature. And here, coming more back to the more positive part of it, and 2020, as some of you might know, had to be a critical year, a milestone year for biodiversity. We are still moving forward on it to be that way, but of course, with this crisis, it has also complicated this further, but also is building maybe or opening new opportunities for that. But there is increasingly a global agenda and a recognition that we need to aim higher to bend the curve. We cannot just keep it going and talk about sustainability in this sense, we need to talk about regeneration and building back, increasing the diversity in our systems. Because if we think about sustainability, we are saying we need to sustain the level that we have. No, we cannot just sustain, we need to increase the level that we have. And there is an opportunity for many different functions to increase the biodiversity in our food systems. Now, of course, the big question is then, how do we do that? And there are many different pieces of the puzzle. From my perspective, it's a fascinating learning process also. Or organizations too. But there is a global increased recognition and awareness that this food systems biodiversity is kind of a nature-based solution and a level of systems change, and that this is a potential entry point that can act upon multiple benefits, multiple outcomes simultaneously, and thereby avoid certain of the trade-offs that we have seen in the past. And so it aligns well with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, where biodiversity in our food systems, or agrobiodiversity, we use that term in short, but it refers kind of to the same concepts, the broader concept that I explained, that it's an entry point where we can build and around different outcomes. And while biodiversity in food systems, agrobiodiversity in food systems was previously sitting more, if we talk now a bit about the scientific part, in very specific journals, like around ecosystems, agriculture, it is now really, we are now integrating the science much more in the multidisciplinary world, and there is much more interest and attention for it also in these multidisciplinary journals for it. It's also in the big reports, some of the big reports that came out in 2019, the EAT Planetary Health Diet that looks at sustainable solutions for human and planetary health. Agrobiodiversity is specifically mentioned there, and food biodiversity. Also in EPES, there is now the a new Nexus project on food biodiversity and health, with agriculture a central piece and food systems thinking a central piece. And also the last year, the big milestone report of the FAO came out on biodiversity for food and agriculture. So the science has been really building up for stronger and stronger around this, and particularly around the note of the importance of this multifunctionality and the opportunity around that. But this also is increasing with multiple actors around the food system, with farmers, consumers, and also governments and food and agribusinesses, because they see kind of the different types of risks that can be partly managed by agrobiodiversity, as well as the opportunities in terms of innovation, adaptation, choice, cultural choice, etc. Now, critical here is, and how do we connect these different food systems actors better so that the different raters can start turning for biodiversity in our food systems? And here it's, as we collaborate with many of them and we are work together with them, it's we are exploring and we are exploring different options and strategies of better creating and connecting incentives across these different actors of the food systems to try to bend the incentives of the whole system, which is now more moving towards simplification with increased risks and volatility, etc. And here I will give you a couple of examples, but there are of course more out there. But a couple of examples of our work also is, one is increased use of citizen science to make visible and to increase the ownership of this diversity with all the farmers as well as up to the consumers. So this is a program that is called Seeds for Needs, where we work together with the farmers to map out the diversity of different varieties of durum wheat or different other crops. This is for pictures from Ethiopia, and where they map out the traits and where we can map that out together with the biological and genetic traits. And then you can see that, for example, the Ethiopian durum wheat varieties are in a very different cluster genetically than the Mediterranean durum wheat and then the commercially improved durum wheat. And they have an incredible richness here to meet different needs in terms of drought tolerance, etc. And the farmers are very proud on that. And you see it reaches also the scientific level of being in high impact journals. Then the other part is on the other side of the value chain, again, citizen science with the consumers to build seasonal calendars that maps out the diversity of different, this is particularly for fruits and vegetables, of different fruits and vegetables that are available and then backed up by recipes as well as where and how they can be accessed. This is on one end kind of local initiatives with farmers up to consumers. Then at a bigger picture level, a key point is also for better creating these incentives is that to measure it, we need to measure it. To manage it, we need to measure it. So we have been building an agro-biodiversity index that brings particularly this message of multifunctionality together and what are type of actions and status that companies as well as countries can do to and here applications with the private and the sector around risk and opportunity assessment, global policy alignment, intervention planning, ranking and benchmarking, and different country profiles that we develop together with the countries around the biodiversity and food systems profile. Then with the private sector, we are working with Food Lab Accelerator at Google to make a more traceability and transparency tool that can help make the awareness and the measures of biodiversity in our food systems more available from the farmer up to the consumer. And we are working with others to also build it in supply chain tools that are used by companies to explore their sustainability scores compared to others. So these are just some examples. It's from kind of the farmer and consumer scale, and here up to the cross-country level with biodiversity for food and nutrition program, where evidence is linked with policy and awareness creation, and this particularly with a focus on nutrient-rich species, particularly of underutilized species, and for which the nutrition profile is not yet available. So by making these available, and they can be taken up also in large institutional programs like school meal programs, etc. So these are just some examples, and then as a fourth example, it's also it's us as the consumer. How can we as the consumer, as we are in the driver's seat of the food system, more drive the system towards increasing diversity? When you go, and if there's one takeaway message of this, when you go to the supermarket, explore the different varieties that are there. Check also where the varieties are sourced from and what type of system maybe that is related to that, and how that enhances or supports biodiversity in our food system or not. So by this, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and open the room for questions with maybe just one final note. this guy says, I'm on the verge of a major breakthrough, but I'm also at the point where chemistry leaves off and physics begins, so I'll just have to drop the whole thing here. And this is where biodiversity has for a long time been a matter of people working in environment, but with the food system, it's and overall also biodiversity is not just a matter of people working in environment. It's we really need all the different disciplines to increase the interest and actions to this, to handle that and search for solutions together. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosaline. That was absolutely fascinating, and I definitely have many more questions that we'll be able to discuss. But let's, so we have one question already from Juliet in the chat box. Let's see if we can collect a couple of more questions. So if anybody has a question, you can either simply turn on your microphone and ask your question, or if you prefer, you can type it into the text box. Or if you'd like, maybe Rosaline, you could address the question by Juliet, which is about the nutritional value of heavily selected crops, like genetic monocultures.
Yeah.
And then in the meantime, everyone else can think about their questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Juliet, for the great question also. Yeah, we have actually a study and we developed a new metric around nutritional yield, where we look specifically at yield for specific nutrients in different types of settings and how it changes over time. And we see also that, for example, some of the crops that were heavily optimized for yield, for productivity, like rice, wheat, they are some of the less nutritious grains. Like if you compare them to other grains like sorghum, etc., that have been less optimized in terms of variety selection for yield, they are much richer in particularly in the micronutrients. And we did a global study also where we look at kind of the whole, and we focused specifically on the grains, and where we see that the grains that were really where the selection was really driven by maximizing productivity, that there you see the nutritional yield going down, and as overall grain nutritional yield is going down, particularly for iron and zinc. Genetically very well explained. So selection has been with a focus on maximizing caloric yield or quantity, just quantity, and not looking at more the diversity of nutrients.
Thanks, Rosaline, for that. May I have a quick follow-up question? Is there, do you know if there are attempts of bringing back nutritional values into these crops, say that we have high yield crops, but that also contain high nutritional values?
Yeah, definitely. So, which is also managed by the thank you. Program, a global program called Harvest Plus, that focuses specifically about breeding back nutritional values into these crops. But there is also more and more science that shows it's of course not only the crop. It's also it's not just the variety of the crop. It's also the soil, so that there is a link between the soil fertility and the nutritional quality of the crops. Particularly, some crops are more sensitive for that than others. So that's also another area where there is more management towards enhancing nutrition. And I mean, in general, over the last 10 years, there has been an increased interaction between nutrition and agriculture and an increased integration of nutrition smart or nutrition sensitive practices in agriculture, and diversification is a key part of that. Yeah, I see there are several other questions coming up.
Yeah, there are 3 questions after, so maybe Rosie, you can just respond to those questions in order.
Yeah. So what could be the incentives for farmers to massively switch to agrobiodiversity? Yeah, that's a really good and not an easy question. We are working a lot around that. And of course, what is critical for farmers is one, that they get a good market price for what they have, and also a certain level of stability of that market price, and risk management. Risk management is critical for farmers, and this is not only for smallholder farmers in low income settings, but also for farmers here around us. But farmers cannot act on this alone, and the incentives for the farmers are intrinsically there, but they need to be integrated in the supply chain. And like contract, we are working with different companies that are, for example, creating incentives together with the farmers, but guaranteeing them a transition period. So if there are farmers that are not yet diversifying now, they need a certain amount of time to transition. And if often these farmers have only 1-year contract with these type of companies, now these companies are moving towards longer year, multiple year contracts in order to provide the farmers the time to transition and then it can be more sustainable on itself afterwards. So there are the intrinsic incentives for the farmers, risk management, also, yeah, and that's a key one, but then there are the ones that are so much connected to the rest of the food system and the supply chain, and these need to come from the companies or the buyers and the market. Also, if you think on smaller scale where you don't have these big companies that much active, it's also the consumer, of course, drives the demand, and that's why creating more awareness with the consumers, working with connecting in the program, the JEF program, it's linking the farmers to the school meal programs and creating the incentives and the demand with these young children for this larger diversity of food, rather than just wanting to eat maize meal or something. I see. No, I don't see the chats anymore so well.
I can read them out if you would like.
Could you please? So,
yes,
okay,
yes.
I see them again. Yeah.
Yes.
Could you please elaborate more on the Agrobiodiversity Index? I was wondering to whom this index is developed for. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and also we can don't hesitate to reach out to me if you would like even more after when I finish this webinar. But the Agrobiodiversity Index is a whole kind of story bit on itself. We initially started developing it for on demand of governments of countries, but as we were developing it, there was increased interest actually from the private sector, and this was coming particularly from food and agriculture companies, as well as from the investment side, because I mean, food and agriculture, there is a lot of potential to do more in terms of sustainable finance, but there are also not metrics for that yet. So we developed this together with a diversity of potential users from the public sector as well as from the private sector, also with the World Farmers Organization. We got input from many different types of organizations, and also collaborating with other research institutes that are working more on the so-called wild biodiversity part. And as there is an overall increased interest in including biodiversity much more in overall sustainability measures, but a complicated piece is that there is not yet, it's not just one measure, because the value of biodiversity is so much the multifunctionality. And so we have the state that the Agrobiodiversity Index is in now is that there are these applications for governments, and we have particularly developed it at this moment for national governments, but it's also possible to adapt it further for local governments, city governments, or district governments, for companies, and this can be companies across the supply chain. I see there's a question of Nestle. So Nestle is also one of the companies that has been kind of pioneering parts of it. Different types of companies, and that's where we are also working with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, that is just next to the Graduate Institute. And then also for projects. So it can also be used to design, to evaluate, or to assess projects. And so these are the main stakeholders at the moment that it's developed for. And yeah, so Google's involvement is not so much in the development of the index, but in using the framework of the index for the supply chain tool. And so Google Food is something relatively new. I'm also not yet so familiar with it, but they reached out in order to participate in one of their accelerators, where they brainstorm during a 6-month period about potential solutions to help the food system. And so one of the accelerators that we then developed together with them was an Agrobiodiversity accelerator, and this will actually be launched later this month on the International Day of Biodiversity. And where we are in this next phase going to test this kind of traceability tool, where we incorporated the index framework in a blockchain technology to have more transparency about what is happening actually in the supply chain regarding biodiversity. I don't know if that sufficiently answered the question. And what do you think of regenerative agriculture? Yeah, so I think regenerative agriculture is a bit a new term, right? Moving from sustainable agriculture to regenerative agriculture. I think there is still a lot of, I think I personally really like the philosophy behind it, that we move beyond the sustaining, we move in building an agriculture that regenerates, like brings in, moves up the negative curves. And for biodiversity, I think this particularly speaks well, like regenerating, moving it towards building and increasing again, moving the bend, but not just sustaining. But I think there is still a lot of vagueness around what is actually meant, and like it's just a term and a philosophy. It's now a question: will this move, will this move us and our food systems actors really more in a better direction? And how to use that term and philosophy to move in a better direction. I think the positive thing about it is that it doesn't mean like sustaining. It means we can improve things. Yeah. Oh, that's thank you. Okay. We still have some time. Do you have?
Yes, we have a couple of minutes, so we could there'll be many more questions, I'm sure, but maybe if you could take the last question from Juliette.
Yeah. So we have. Do you have some information about specifics on dairy products? Where can I find it? On dairy products, they are, and yeah, I mean, and there are also specific companies, particularly in the Netherlands, that are looking into that more. I can link more afterwards. How much interest in increasing biodiversity in food supplies from global corporations such as Nestle. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a really interesting topic, and it's also a lot of learning experience from our side. So we are working with more and more with these types of global corporations, and this often through the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they are also hosting this initiative. It's called One Planet Business for Biodiversity. And it's a group of 18 companies that really want to position themselves as pioneers and champions for biodiversity in business. And they say they are already beyond making the business case. They believe biodiversity is part of the business case, and they don't find it necessary anymore kind of to make the business case, but they are kind of a group of companies that really wants to position themselves as such, and also convince other companies to follow. And Nestle is also part of that group. But it's also a lot of learning experience, like of course how these, for our side, how these companies work. And you often have kind of the sustainability group that is a champion within Nestle, but then also still needs to make the business case for the corporation as a whole. So also within Nestle and within these big companies, you have of course champions that want to move it, but then other parts or other drivers sometimes still hold that back a bit or slow that down. But I think there are groups of companies that want to be the champion on that, and then there is a big group of companies that also are recognizing it, that are not so much the champions, but that are also making changes in their operations. And yeah, I'm some days I'm really optimistic, other days it's just going sometimes so slow, you know. Yeah.
I think that might be a good note to end it. So at least there are some days that are optimistic, which is good. I hope that that all of us feel at least optimistic on some days. So thank you so much, Rosaline, for joining us today and for giving this fascinating presentation. And thank you to everybody else for joining and for engaging. I guess what I would like to say at the end is that these seminars, whether they are in person or whether they are online, as we're doing now, the intention is really to introduce people to each other, to engage in ongoing research. Clearly, not the end of this is not the end of the work and not the end of the engagement. So I do encourage everybody to keep in touch and keep thinking with each other. Just as a reminder, again, this session has been recorded, so it will be online on the site's website, and also all the upcoming events. You can also find them on the site's website. So do keep track of that. Thank you all again, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.